Welcome everybody. I'm delighted to see so many people here. My name is David Rubain. I am the Pro Vice Chancellor for Culture, Equality and Inclusion here at the University of Sussex. And I am absolutely delighted to welcome this evening's guests, about whom I'll say one or two things in a moment. This event is part of our in Conversation With series, which is an endeavour as part of our broader Inclusive Sussex strategy to bring together people with important things to say around inclusion in its broader sense and inequality and diversity and oppression. Either academics or people from other parts of life who have perspectives which we feel that we can engage with and discuss. So you may or may not know that we have had in the past Dan Gillespie-Sells, who is the lead singer of a band called The Feeling, on talking about liberation through storytelling. We've had Professor Tom Shakespeare on what's next for disability inclusion, Leila Kogbara and Jane Farrell on inclusive leadership, Professor Nicola Dandridge and Dr. Omar Khan on intergenerational justice, and Fox Fisher on trans-inclusive stories. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted. I can't tell you how delighted I am, and I'm not going to spare Gary's blushes in my excitement, to welcome Professor Gary Younge, in my view, a rock star public intellectual. Many of you may know Gary from his journalism and his writing. He's an award-winning author, broadcaster, and professor of sociology at the University of Manchester in England, currently specialising in the Black War experience in Europe. He was, as I mentioned, formerly a columnist and US correspondent at The Guardian, and is an editorial board member of The Nation magazine and winner of the 2023 Orwell Prize for Journalism. He's got an enormous CV. I'm just going to paraphrase some of it. He also co-presents a podcast called Over the Top and Under the Rainbow. Sorry, Under the Radar. Sorry. Under the Radar. He's written 6 books, most recently Dispatches from the Diaspora, From Nelson Mandela to Black Lives Matter, and several publications, including the New York Review of Books, Granta, GQ, the Financial Times, and the New Statesman. He's also made several radio and television documentaries on subjects ranging from gay marriage to Brexit. He has 6 honorary degrees and has won numerous awards for his books and journalism on both sides of the Atlantic. Tonight, we will have a talk from Gary about his current work, which I'm going to leave him to tell you about. And following that, we will have a small panel discussion with 2 colleagues, and we'll introduce ourselves respectively at that point. And we will make time for a Q&A afterwards with Gary. And then I hope that as many of you who can will join us for a drink after the event. So without any further delay, can I ask you to welcome Professor Gary Younge.
Under the Rainbow doesn't sound too bad. I might may well suggest that. So yes, I'm just going to start. And I'm going to start with a story from my childhood. When I was 10, my mum made me stay up and watch the mini-series, The Holocaust. Very interesting piece of parenting, this, which tells the story of the Shoah and tells the story of the Shoah through the Vices, which is a fictional. It's a fictional middle-class Jewish family who lived in Berlin. Before I'd watched this miniseries, I had never heard of the Holocaust. And if I knew Jews, I didn't know that I did. The only time Jews came up in my life was in the jokes of the Englishman, the Scotsman, the Irishman variety. They were only anti-Semitic, also when people were talking about Tottenham Hotspur. But then I didn't really know what anti-Semitism was either at that age. So watching the Holocaust, this miniseries, was a shock. And my mum had said, this is your story too, which was a thing that my mum would do. She did that when we went to watch Gandhi as well. Well, this is your story too. And she wouldn't always enlighten me in how. Just that was up for me to work out. But in a way, I knew what she meant. Because growing up in the 70s, there was a sense of precarity that I certainly had about being black in Britain, which felt like it could have gone anywhere. Already by that young age, I knew that people who thought you knew, that people who you thought you knew could suddenly turn on you. I knew that your very presence could provoke hostility or even violence, that the people who others might look to for protection, police, social workers, teachers, could be on the other side. And I found it traumatizing, obviously, but I was also baffled by it. The only form of discrimination that I had experienced and could conceive of at that point was anti-black racism. Not strange for an 11-year-old, I don't think, an 11-year-old black person anyway. I wasn't particularly aware of what drove that either. Roots came out the same year as this, and that was when I really learned about slavery. It's not that I didn't know that slavery had existed in the way that I did know the Holocaust, but I hadn't spent much time thinking about it, worrying about it, or understanding its relationship to me. But I thought I understood how that worked, because I was black, and people would see that, and then they would respond to it. And I had no control over that response. So some of those responses would be hostile, some even violent, but it wasn't something that I could pass, hide, or deny. What I found so confusing when I thought about the Holocaust at that age was how anyone knew who was what or whom. In my mind, they were all white people. Why didn't the Jews just say they weren't Jewish, I thought? How could the Nazis be so sure who was whom? I was 10, and that was old enough in my own way to understand that it was possible to erect a deadly system of racial control, but still not old enough to understand how such a system could work without clear visual markers. Now, that confusion didn't haunt me like the image of the camps did, but it did stay with me. And it would be another 8 years when my brother went to study in Northern Ireland and I went to study in Scotland before I would start to have an inkling of how this would work. For I soon realised two quite important things. The first was, particularly in Northern Ireland, I could find out someone's religion usually in just 3 questions. What's your name? Where do you live? And if both those didn't work, where did you go to school? Second reason was that for reasons related to my political curiosity, I actually really did want to know where they were from. And so I realized in this context that visual markers signify different things. Today, even though black people comprise just 0.2% of Northern Ireland, Derry has a black mayor and Northern Ireland football team fielded its first black player 27 years ago. That was in the late 80s. So if anyone in Northern Ireland saw you, they could safely assume, although they could be wrong, that you weren't from there. And that could cut one of 2 ways in Northern Ireland, particularly in the 80s. There was a chance that you were in the British Army, in which case you were very involved in the dominant local rivalry and very vulnerable. And it was for that reason, that very reason, that my brother grew a beard, which he still has, because you couldn't wear a beard in the army. So this was this strange signifier of safety. But otherwise, you were understood to be outside the primary conflict there. The joke went that if people from Northern Ireland ever met a person in a turban, they would only want to know if they were a Catholic Sikh or a Protestant Sikh. That brings me to the subject of this talk, colouring between the lines. Because in my research on post-war Black Europe, I've become familiar with a range of work around the experiences of Black Germans under the Nazis that offers some insight into the ambivalent role that visible difference can play in the system of racial oppression, and some sense of how that works out as a lived experience. Throughout, I would argue that it would be helpful to think of racism as a language with many dialects, that they are recognizable to all, but also recognizably different in their articulation, history, cultural influence and context and so on. Rare is the country or culture that does not speak the language of racism, but in no two places is it spoken the same. I also want to say at the outset that those looking for thumbs up, thumbs down, it was worse for one group than it was for another, you're in the wrong place. There is enough misery to go around. This is really a talk for people who would rather understand how the misery is made so they can eradicate it than those who want to measure it so that they can rank it. There will be comparisons and parallels. There will be no equivalences or competition. This particular story starts in 1884 with the Berlin Conference called by Otto von Bismarck to carve up what remained of Africa among the European powers. Most of the good stuff had gone by then, but the Germans got their hands on Namibia, Togo, Cameroon, and what they called German East Africa, which includes Tanzania's mainland, as well as some of Burundi and Rwanda and a small piece of Mozambique. For the most part, the Germans organized their colonies according to the same rules of brutality and bigotry as the other European powers, with one exception. Between 1904 and 1908, they committed the century's first genocide against the Herero and Nama people in Namibia. During the first phase, they trapped people in the desert where they died of dehydration and starvation. Those who were left were taken to concentration camps where they died of disease and exhaustion. I mention this to establish that when it came to Black people, Germany had a track record when it came to anti-Black racism that was in many ways indistinguishable from other powers in Europe. It locates what will come next as part of a continuum. In the words of the late Tony Judt in his book Post-War, overseas in their colonies, European states had habitually indentured or enslaved indigenous populations for their own benefit. They had not been above the use of torture, mutilation, or mass murder to coerce their victims into obedience. But since the 18th century, these practices were largely unknown among Europeans themselves, at least west of the Blood and Prut rivers. Put bluntly, to a significant extent, the shock following the Holocaust resided not so much in the fact that the European state had committed those atrocities, but that they had committed them in Europe against other Europeans. Following their defeat in the First World War, the Germans had their colonies taken away from them and redistributed among the other colonial powers. As part of wartime reparations, the Versailles Treaty also ordered the Germans to relinquish the Rhineland to the victorious powers. The French took the lion's share and sent Black colonial troops from North and West Africa to Germany as an occupying force. To be occupied by foreign troops was bad enough. To be occupied by Black foreigners was more than many could bear. A moral panic was confected from misinformation that bestial Black men with uncontrollable sexual urges were ravaging and raping German women. They called it the Schwarze Schmach, or Black Horror. There was never any evidence that women under occupation in those areas were any more vulnerable to rape or assault than by occupying soldiers anywhere else. In other words, one needn't be in denial about the capacity of Black male soldiers to rape people to understand that is not particular to them being Black, that is particular to them being men. But just as was the case in Southport, there was a market for these kind of racially loaded misinformation with willing buyers and willing sellers. 400 to 500 children who emerged from relationships with colonial troops were branded the Rhineland bastard. This was the basis for the Netflix original about a young Black girl and her mother during Nazi Germany, which I recommend. In Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler described the children of the Rhineland, the mixed race children of the Rhineland, as a contamination of the white race by Negro blood on the Rhine in the heart of Europe. This was not a particularly remarkable view for a white European to hold at the time. But of course, it was Hitler and he didn't stop there. He argued that in Mein Kampf, the Jews were responsible for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland with the ultimate idea of bastardizing the white race, which they hate, and thus lowering its cultural and political level so that the Jew might dominate. He also implied that this was a plot on behalf of the French, since the population of France was increasingly negrified. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they passed a law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring. In 1937, 2 years after Nuremberg, local officials were asked to identify all such children in the Rhineland and subject them to forcible sterilisation, which they did. So by the time it came to the Second World War, Black Germans as a whole numbered maybe a couple of thousand. Some were born to local women and French colonial troops in the Rhineland. Some were the offspring of white Germans and local people who'd met in the colonies. Many were students or workers who had come from the former colonies and stayed. Few Germans would have met a black person at that time, but most would have known of their presence, thanks in no small part to the Rhineland Horror campaign. A range of autobiographies by and interviews with Black Germans in the run-up to the war suggest a variety of experiences, but with two commonalities. The first was that all of them felt subject to a system of racial control and oppression, which excluded them from full citizenship and equal rights that carried with it the threat of extermination. That was true in all of the autobiographies and accounts that I've read of Black people in Germany at the time. A feature worth noting in passing here is the degree to which Nazi Germany borrowed from America's racial architecture when it came to constructing a system of racial control, which is painstakingly set out in James Q. Whitman's Hitler's American Model. One of the most compelling accounts of the time is a book called Black German by Theodore Michael. Michael was born in Berlin in 1925 as the youngest son of a Cameroonian migrant and his German wife. He would have been 8 when the Nazis came to power, not much younger than I was when I watched the Holocaust. As a child, he could see the system was discriminating between people, but did not understand that they were discriminating against him. He wrote in Black German, when the Jews were insulted, especially in Der Stürmer, which was a newspaper, I didn't think much of it. I had Jewish schoolmates and they acted just like everybody else. You only noticed that they were Jews when there was a head count or a survey of the students and they were counted separately, which happened to me too. But that didn't mean anything of that. And it made no difference to the atmosphere in the classroom. There was a lot in those papers about racial aliens, but it didn't occur to me as a child, not yet at any rate, that I was what was meant by that phrase. It was also abstract and didn't seem to have anything to do with me. He had, he wrote, wanted to join the Jugendvolk, which was like the Cubs compared to the Scouts of the Hitler Youth. He said all of my schoolmates joined the Jugendvolk and talked excitedly about the comradeship they enjoyed and the games they played. Naturally, they urged me to come along, and naturally I agreed. And when we went to the next meeting of the troop together, just as naturally, I was sent away again. Before I went, though, it was made clear to me that I wasn't one of the Volk, and accordingly couldn't be a member of the Jungvolk. From this point on, for Theodore, things changed at school. The atmosphere was not poisoned yet, but he says, my schoolmates looked at me differently and I saw them with new eyes too. As a youth, he avoided going to the hospital, even though he became quite ill because he knew that if he went, he would be sterilised. He was expelled from school, with his head teacher telling him, unfortunately, new regulations required him to dismiss Michael from school. He recalls, this had nothing to do with my academic performance, it had to do with the new era. I spent my adolescence, wrote Michael, ducking, hiding, trying not to be noticed. But for a black person, that was, of course, incredibly difficult in Nazi Germany. And it's a telling distinction that they did not suffer the stigma of having to wear stars or triangles, yellow for Jews, pink for gays, red for communists, brown for Roma, and so on, for the simple reason that they wore their badge on their face. No one of you looked at a black person in a camp, you didn't need to know why they were there. They were wearing it. There was Fazia Jensen, born in 29, born in Hamburg to Liberian consul general and a German mum who worked in the consulate. Fazia was expelled from school at the age of 13 with the director of the dance school that she was at saying, she can't become a dancer, I'll get in trouble with the Reich Culture Office. You have to imagine when the curtain goes up and there's a black girl standing there, I'll get in trouble. When she got her period, she had to worry about sterilisation. And then there was Gert Schramm, the only black survivor of the camps that we know of, who was the son of an African-American engineer and a white German woman, born in 1929 and raised in Thuringia, the East German land county that only recently voted for the AfD. Schramm's dad was caught returning to see his mum in 1941, and dad was sent to Auschwitz. Schramm himself was arrested a couple of years later and sent after several months in a Gestapo prison to Buchenwald, where he survived until the end of the war. That's his book. And then there's Martha Stark, considerably older than the others, who was born in 1914 in Nuremberg to an African-American dad and a white mum. Stark's testimony suggests her Jewish contemporaries were more aware of where the system was going and what it might do than she was, and that they understood it on her behalf in a way that she didn't. Around 1929, two of the Jewish boys who lived in the same building as her told her that they were fleeing to England while their brothers were going to France. They told her, it's time for you to leave Germany too, because we have learned it's going to be terrible here in a short while. But Stark, writing about this, says she couldn't understand them and told them, I can't believe anybody would try to bother us. We harm nobody. If we leave, we will appear to be guilty of something. And I can't quit school now anyway. She was later taken to have all her features measured, using the Nazis' race-based pseudoscience so they could determine the precise nature of her racial identity. She went on to marry a white German, had children, and had to move from the city she lived in to a quieter village where she felt safer. So there was a system of oppression and ideology which included black people in it and which black people were very aware of. The fact in 1942, as a final solution was really taking off, that Heinrich Himmler asked for a census of black Germans suggests that the Nazis may have had plans to refine the system that they had set up. But all of the testimony from that era suggests that while a system was in place, when it came to black people, its implementation was inconsistent, and the ideology underpinning it less well rehearsed and formally scripted than for others. In short, while their persecution was systemic, it was not systematic. Visible difference marked them out as inferior and to be excluded. It did not, however, in and of itself, provide instructions for how to handle that inferiority. So black Germans existed in these liminal spaces where the threat of annihilation was omnipresent, but where their ultimate fate was unpredictable. They couldn't effectively hide, and it would be a struggle to be hidden. This is the same reason why there were relatively few black resistance fighters in Europe compared to the number of black prisoners of war. Because where would you hide? How would you go on, or France or Belgium? Most of them certainly couldn't pass, but then the system wasn't primarily looking for them and held no coherent or consistent plan for them either. So in every story I've cited here, there are brushes with peril, but also space to navigate and negotiate until the next moment of peril. Of his school days, Theodore Michael, this was one of the black people who's in the camps when they're liberated, and you can see that he has no star. Although some of the teachers clearly belonged to the Nazi party, writes Michael, our teachers were mostly sympathetic to me, especially when it came to sports. He once heard two teachers say, a great prospect for the 44 Olympics. Too bad. Martha Stark tells the remarkable story of going to a public swimming pool where she met a Jewish friend, Walter Stein. Walter is approached by four men who force him out of the pool because they know he's Jewish. When she gets back into the pool, having gone kind of to his aid, A man called Meixner, later revealed to be a Nazi big shot, demands that she leave too. He says, that dirty Jew has left. What about you? Your father was a nigger and you're a bastard. We have no place anymore for people like you. But two of the men who'd assaulted Walter, the Jewish boy, went on to defend Martha. And the crowd at the pool, who'd known Martha all her life, eventually turned against the Nazi, instead encouraging her to use the pool as often as she wants. Stark later says, when I went home that day, I locked myself in my room and wrote a long letter to Julius Streicher. I tried to appeal to his ideals as a National Socialist. Also, I told him that, in my opinion, men like Meixner made the entire Nazi party look bad. She was invited to the local Nazi headquarters to make her complaint in person. She tells her story again. Then Meixner is invited in to tell his story. And Starks then picks up the story, says, Meixner started again to get nasty about me, but another man in there immediately ordered him to stop and called him a fool in front of all of his fellows. He then ordered Meixner to apologize to me. Meixner was compelled to say that he was sorry. Later, when Martha is married and with children, and she's moved to a small town, Birking, a friend of hers within the party called Neuffer warns her to leave town because the state is onto her. Martha says, Neuffer then told me with pain, these accounts are mostly in remapping Black Germany. And this was, Martha's story was plastered over the Pittsburgh Courier, the African-American newspaper from Pennsylvania. Neuffer then told me with pain written all over his face that he had received an order to send me and my girls to Auschwitz. He said that my marriage had been automatically annulled because Herbert, who was away at war, and I had married against the law. Neuffer did his best to delay sending us away. Martha stays put. A few days later, Neuffer comes again. He was terribly upset, she wrote. He said the Nazis were putting pressure on him, that the authorities at Auschwitz had complained because my children and I had not reached there according to orders. Neuffer wrung his hands as though in great perplexity. He said he couldn't allow me to stay in Birking any more than one more week. He seemed to pray with me that the Americans would come. So they did. A particularly salient story, it was just at the end of the war, so she didn't end up being sent to Auschwitz. Particularly salient story, which illustrates the full range of its inconsistencies, is that of Hans Haupt, whose story we know largely thanks to the German academic Tina Kampt, who wrote this book, Other Germans, among other things, but this is where the story comes from. Haupt was born in 1920 to a Black Algerian father who was part of the colonial occupation and a white German mother, so he was one of those Rhineland children. He was allowed to join Hitler Youth, but he was also sterilized when he was 16. The father of a friend of his who was in the SS signed off the necessary papers so he could work at a railroad, saying, well, you're not German, you're not Black, you're Hans. In 1939, he was conscripted to fight in the Wehrmacht, along with his peers, only to be told when he went to sign up that he was unworthy of service because he was Black. Describing his precarious position within the system, Hauck explains why he tried to commit suicide when he was called up for preliminary training the second time. The training was conducted by the Sturmabteilung, he explains. I never had anything to do with them. Here in the Hitler Youth, everyone knew me. No one would have wanted to do me any harm. Out there, no one knew me. I attempted suicide in Opladen because I couldn't get away from it anymore. Proof of Aryan ancestry and that whole mess. Where would I get that from? He survived his suicide attempt, and in 1942, he was conscripted again and accepted. He told Tina Kampt, maybe I could have refused, but then I wouldn't be able to talk about it now. I know about one such case, a friend that I was sterilized with. He never came back. He got sent to a camp, and I went to war because I saw it as a chance. it was the first time that I was treated the same as others. Because the other Aryan German boys, my mates, were called up too, and I wanted that. And then I was quite conscious of my fate, that I had a chance 50-50. Either I survived it or I didn't, and I did survive. Hauck was sent to the Eastern Front, where he made private first class within months, so he was promoted. He was wounded 5 times, captured by the Red Army in 1945, and went to spend 4 years in a Soviet camp. One of the few people, I would imagine, who said of his time in the Soviet camp, yeah, that was great. That was great because I finally felt like I was just being treated as a German, which I never got in Germany. When it came to compensation after the war, Black Germans who had lived through the Third Reich suddenly, visible as they were, hyper-visible as they were, came invisible to the bureaucracy. Fazia Jensen, who we spoke about earlier, was rejected several times from compensation because officials could not establish whether Black people fell under the racial laws. For example, Zoya Aqua Kaufman was born in Berlin to a Jewish mother and a Cameroonian dad. Forced out of school, refused the right to train as a pediatrician. She became a dancer until she was banned from doing that too. And then she fled underground fearing sterilisation. Caught in Prague in 1944 with their son, Hans Joachim, they were sent to Pankratz prison and were only released on May 13, 1945. Offered compensation on the basis of her Jewish identity, but not her African ancestry. Every time I appeared in the office, his colleagues couldn't conceal their amusement, she said, talking about the people that she went to apply for compensation for. They kept saying, well, I may believe that your father is a nigger, which can mean Negro or the N-word, but the higher authorities don't have to believe it since they can't see you. This is actually a constant theme around Black Europe for quite some years, that partly because of the camps, and in France because of republicanism, Britain and Ireland are the only 2 countries in Europe that actually count on the basis of race. And that's only been since 1991. And so when it came to definition, there was another story about this in the Soviet Union, where the daughter of a Polish immigrant, an African American who's born there, goes to get her ethnicity, and they're like, well, I can see you're different, but we've got this is a category error. We don't know where to, computer says no. We've got no way of doing this. She goes home, comes back with a picture of her dad, and the Soviets then allow her to call herself African American. But this is not just true of the objects of racism. It's true of racism itself. Put bluntly, you can't see racism any more than you can see democracy or capitalism. You can at times see the outcomes of racism, a rundown area in a segregated city, a vicious and violent attack, a person screaming epithets, the George Floyd video, but racism is a system, and you can no more see it than you can see democracy or capitalism. If that seems like an opaque point, then take for a minute the murder of George Floyd in 2020. We all saw it. It happened during the COVID pandemic at a time when Black people were dying in far more disproportionate numbers than the police could ever kill. They were particularly vulnerable because of where they lived, the jobs they did, the houses they lived in, the food they could afford, their ability to work from home, and so on. These are things that can't be caught on camera and shared on YouTube, but they are the lethal, pervasive consequences of racism. And this matters, paradoxically. Once you understand that racism is not visible, it makes it easier to see what it is. Not a series of isolated incidents involving malevolent bigots making vengeful decisions in a never-ending morality play, but a range of systemic processes built on presumption, assumption, confidence, ignorance, and exclusionary networks, all buttressed by the dead weight of privilege and historical domination. The moment of George Floyd's murder and the conflagration which ensued offered us an opportunity to trace the connective tissue between racism at its most banal and its most brazen. I can't breathe was not just the cry of the dying Floyd and the chant of the demonstrators, but the last gasps of the ailing pandemic patient on a respirator. Visible difference, which quite often the differences the system trains us to see, precisely because they have consequence, can be crucial, but they don't have to be. It makes sense to focus on it, but not to fetishize it, because while it is a common feature of racist systems, it is neither a necessary or universal one. That was the first lesson. The second lesson was that a system constructed with and through racial control will, by its nature, be prone to absurdities, contradictions, and inconsistencies. We start with the fact that race itself is a construct, a nonsense to make sense out of the system that racism has made. The definition of who or what is black or white or other shifts with time and place. In different moments, in relatively recent time, the Greeks, the Irish, Portuguese, and Italians, for example, have not been considered quite white enough. Jews who are Caucasian, there are many Jews who aren't, can go in and out of being understood as white. As Barbara J. Field famously pointed out, a white woman can give birth to a black child, but a black woman cannot give birth to a white child. None of this makes sense outside of the context in which it was formed. One of the problems that we have in, I want to just give an example from, a couple of examples from my own life there. And one is as a foreign student. So I studied French and Russian at university. So I spent 6 months in Paris and 6 months in what was then Leningrad. And my 6 months in Paris were the most intensely racist experience that I've ever had in my life. And I don't say that lightly. I was beaten up by the cops. I was routinely refused entry to bars and clubs and restaurants. People would ask me what color I was when I called for an apartment. It was intense. I was stopped and searched probably about 2-3 times a week. And my story didn't add up. I was a scruffy 21-year-old black guy with plaids who was registered at the Sorbonne. So nothing I said they believed. When I went out, I had to carry my passport with me, even if I just went out for a paper, because I didn't know when I was going to get stopped. And I didn't know how long. If I didn't have that with me, it could take like 45 minutes. So that was France. And then I went to what's now St. Petersburg. And it was a particular moment, 1991. America had just defeated Iraq in the first Gulf War in 1990. The Soviet Union was collapsing. America was understood in that moment to be a beacon in some ways. So much so that there were these America was sending, this was a romantic time when America was sending aid. They've stopped doing there were these chicken legs called nogi bush, were the legs of George Bush, Bush's legs. And these were part of USA being sent to the Soviet Union at the time. And people would look at me because of my affect. Actually, most of the things that made me a problem in France made me American in Russia. My plaits, my jeans, my sneakers, my affect. There was some way that they knew that I wasn't African. If they thought I was African, it would have been a real problem, because they understood Africans, Cubans, anybody from the developing world as being part of a story about Soviet decline. We wasted all this money on you people. And our kind of highfalutin understanding of who we were and all of this solidarity money, and what was it for? They were our now asylum seekers or refugees or people on small boats. That's what, in their mind, they equated them with. It's the only time in my life anybody's looked at me and said, here comes money. In France, I couldn't stop a cab I couldn't get a cab, sometimes even at a taxi rank. When I waited, it was my turn. You got, and the cab's like, I'm not taking you anywhere. In Russia, cars would turn into cabs at the site. Where do you want to go? You'll be paying dollars, and so on. I had to vouch for white people. Seriously, going into hotels and other places of privilege, nobody thought for a second that I was gonna not be able to pay the bill. But the white students that I was with, they might have been Russian, but there was no sense that I could have been Russian. And then there's this picture, and there's a lot going on in this picture, but I just want you to concentrate on my T-shirt there, which only makes sense in Britain. No, nowhere else does that make sense. You have to know that in Britain colonized the Irish, that the patterns of migration were such that we were here at the same time and suffering not the same, but that the racisms coincided. And so there were these signs, as we know, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And so this is obviously a riposte to that. I couldn't wear that in America and anyone understand it. I don't think you could wear that anywhere else in the world and anybody understand it. What the hell have the dogs and the Irish and black people got to do with anybody? So these are examples of different languages of racism being spoken and the absurdity of the notion of race. Angela Davis, Birmingham, in what would have been the 50s. Racist Birmingham, they called it Bombingham because of the reign of terror against black people. She went into a shop and pretended to be French. She could try on anything she wanted, so long as she was pretending to be French, because then she wasn't speaking their language and they didn't have to worry about it. And actually, she writes about this in her autobiography, that people would fawn over her. Oh, someone from France, how very exciting, and so on and so forth. We go back to my story of France and Russia. I'm the same person, literally wearing the same clothes in both places. And yet, it's one of those things that, the border doesn't, I don't cross the border crosses me. So one of the problems we have in understanding these systems is that we take their premises at face value. In America during the 50s and 60s, the battle lines in the South were drawn between integration and segregation. But in reality, that was never the issue. The South was always far more integrated than the North. Black women breastfed white children, were forced to sleep with the men. Servants often lived in the house or on the ground. In most Southern autobiographies, the white child's best friend until school age is usually the gardener's or the maid's child. Strom Thurmond, who ran for the presidency in 1948 as a segregationist, fathered a black daughter by a maid in 1944. The issue was never whether people mixed, but on what basis and to what end. The issue wasn't integration, but white supremacy. So we shouldn't be looking for logic here in Nazi Germany or any other system of racial oppression. As I said earlier, it doesn't have to make sense. It has to work. Every now and then, there's a glitch in the matrix that shows the system up for what it is. Sandra Lamb was born to two white apartheid-supporting Afrikaner parents in the small town of Piet Retief. There they are. Blood tests proved that she was her father's daughter. So let's just take that off the table. Her mum wasn't messing around. Yet Sandra emerged dark-skinned with afro hair, a black girl. And then there's Bliss Breuer, raised in Blue Blood, Connecticut, ostensibly with two white parents, only be told by her father on his deathbed that he had in fact been passing his whole life. Are those two white women or two black women? Who cares, so long as they know their place? To build a system rooted in and acting on these constructs compounds the initial contradiction, because for it to work, there must be rules. And the more a system relies on racial distinction, the more is at stake, and frankly, the more bizarre the rules become. Among the various checks the apartheid system put in place was the pencil test, where they put a pencil in your hair and asked you to bend forward. And if it slid through, you were white. If not, then you were coloured. It's funny, but these were the rules of the state. This could define your life chances. The fingernail test, the pinker the cuticles, the blacker the person, or the scrotum test, assigning race to boys on the basis of the shade of their testicular sac. In 1950, just 2 years after the apartheid regime was founded, the South African state came up with this definition of white for the Population Registration Act. A white person is any person who in appearance obviously is, or who is generally accepted as a white person, other than a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a coloured person. That's their definition. On that definition hangs your life chance. And finally, since both the identities and the systems are constructed by human beings, they are, of course, deeply flawed. Because however much effort they put into parsing and ranking humanity into its convenient component parts, the array of human difference confounds whatever system they erect. The system of extermination the Third Reich built in order to create a dystopia of racial purity was incredibly efficient in its murderous intent, but it was neither rational nor consistent in its targets. Rhineland Bausers notwithstanding, unlike Jews, black people had not been woven tight enough into Germany's story of decline and discord, and so unpicking them from the fabric of German society was not understood as a priority, which also meant that they were not understood to qualify for any reparatory justice afterwards. The fact that they were visibly different impacted the dynamics of their discrimination and the challenges that they faced in avoiding it, but it didn't determine the intensity of their oppression. It's not that the system couldn't detect their difference, but that its impulses were not geared towards acting on that particular finding. It was neither refined nor comprehensive enough to decipher what it saw in a timely manner. It was not indifferent to the fact of colour difference, it was just ambivalent as to how to respond to it. So while their oppression was systematic in nature, it was not systemic in nature, it was not systematic in application. And this ambivalence allowed the space for considerable discretion. For while the system itself was pathological in its capacity to dehumanize and murder, the fact that it was nonetheless run by humans allowed for a level of morality to seep through. We know from other accounts of Germans hiding, saving, or rescuing Jews that space for decency and humanity existed in other contexts. But with Germans of African descent, there was more space, more autonomy within that space, and more people prepared to use that space than for other groups. And that was because, in no small part, the consequences for operating in that space were less severe. They were, black Germans, this is, simultaneously hyper-visible and invisible. One could see them clearly in the flesh, but when it came to the German history of colonialism or qualifications for reparatory justice, they were nowhere to be found. They could not deny that they were black. They could not prove that they had suffered. They still can't prove they're German, even now. If racism is a language of many dialects, then the Nazis were only on an intermediate course when it came to anti-black racism. But they had long proven that they were masters of the vernacular and could make themselves understood. Thank you.
I invite Gary and Naj and Gerhard to join us on the sofa, and I will do some introductions, and then we will try and pick up on some of the themes of Gary's astonishing talk. So we've got microphones there. It's probably best if we use them so that everyone can hear. Just before we that working? Yeah. Before we start, I'd like to welcome and introduce our colleagues. Dr. Gerhard Wolf is an associate professor at the University of Sussex here and a historian of modern German and European political history. His research examines the modern nation state and its often violent demographic interventions that have shaped recent European history. He studied Nazi population policies in occupied Europe during the Second World War, ranging from enforced assimilation to deportation and genocide. And his work also investigates the large-scale expulsions and migrations orchestrated by the Allies after the war and the foundational violence that underpinned the post-world order. And Dr. Naj Rashid is a researcher here at the University of Sussex, focusing on global politics, migration, and security. Her interdisciplinary research explores how identity, gender, race, and power interact within a contemporary political and social structures, particularly affecting marginalized and displaced communities. She draws on post-colonial theory, feminist thought, and critical race theory to study how global power systems impact security, citizenship, and social justice. Dr. Rashid's work emphasizes the intersectionality of refugees, migrants, and other displaced people's identities. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining us. I wonder if we can start with a question. I was intrigued when I first read, Gary, your phrasing of systemic but not systematic, and obviously you've talked about that in your talk. And in relation to the racism that Black people faced in Nazi Germany, as opposed to the anti-Semitism that Jews faced, it struck me that whilst you were distinguishing presumably one as systematic but the other not, that it was a matter of degree rather than. Would that be right, or are you making a stronger or a distinct point?
Well, I guess no. That is what I meant. There was a system of racial control, but it wasn't applied consistently, and it is the consistency that makes it systematic. That, like, well, everybody knows if this person walks into the room with these characteristics, this is what should happen. Mm-hmm. Whereas with Black people, it was like, so what do we do with him or her? Like, obviously they shouldn't be here. Obviously we don't like them. That is the system has already made that clear. But then what we should do about it, whoever is in the room, whoever has the power, that is the thing that was inconsistent, and that's what made it not systematic. That they fell between a range of pathologies and categories, and the people who were operating the system hadn't developed a clear enough idea of what should be done with them.
Thank you. I mean, Gerhard, I know you've had some thoughts about this in relation to your work.
Okay, I mean, I have three comments that I wanted to make in reflection on sorry.
Yeah.
So one was, about the system of racism. And I think what I really like about the talk is that we were not just talking about how racism worked in Germany, but also reminding us that we need to think about not just the how, but also the why. What is the function of racism as a system, but also for a system, for the system of the Nazi state. And the way you put it, I found very elegantly, was unlike Jews, Black people, you roughly said, had not been involved and tied into Germany's story of decline. And so unpicking them from this story was just not a priority for the Nazi party. And it's this anchoring of racism in the political debates of the past and the present, I think that's really important, and it's important for my work, certainly. The second comment I wanted to make is picking up from what David was starting with. You were saying it was systemic but not systematic, and we had a brief discussion about this before this started, and I just wondering whether this is entirely true or whether we should not make two exceptions. One you mentioned already, and that was the systematic sterilization of the Rhineland children, against, by the way, the then German law. And the second one was the massacre of roughly, we don't really know the numbers, between 1,500 and 3,000 French Black soldiers during the invasion of France in June 1940. And if that was systematic, one could ask why. And I think that again would hark back to what you said about the political motivation for this racism, and that is, you're right, I think, that Black people didn't figure prominently in this self-pitying lament of German decline, but there was one case where they did, and that was exactly the occupation of the Rhineland. And I think when the Germans encountered French troops in 1940, that was reactivating this notion of, colonization of Germany by Black soldiers. And I think what the Germans were reacting here in the 1920s and in 1940 was this inversal of the European colonial setting. What Germans found unbearable is that the tables were turned, and now they were colonized, and then by black soldiers. And I think that's probably, or that would be for me, an explanation why in these two cases there was a systematic targeting of Black people and sterilization in one case, murder in the other. And the final point that I wanted to make is on race and racism in general. I think that's probably more pertaining to Nazi Germany and research on Nazi Germany and the historiography of Nazi Germany. You say that racism is a language with many dialects, recognizable to all, but also recognizably different according to cultural context. And I think that's true. But when we look at the practices of discrimination, exploitation, and murder, not just in Nazi Germany, but certainly also in Nazi Germany, there are many languages that are being spoken. It's a cacophony of various languages, some centering around religion, ethnicity, nationalism, and so on. And I just wanted to mention two examples to make this a little bit clearer. One is the comparison between the persecution of Jews and Jewish Germans and Afro-Germans in Germany. And I think you pointed already to what lies behind this difference. That's the political salience of this group in this German narrative. But I think even to understand that better, we would probably have to look at how Jews were woven into this story of German decline. And when we do that, we see that they emerge as this central other against who a common German identity was forged. And to put it briefly, I think while race gave Nazism, Nazi anti-Semitism a conceptual framework, conceptual clarity, I don't think it was the primary force driving anti-Jewish hatred. It's sort of another layer on a much longer and deeper history of anti-Jewish hatred. And the same could be made, same point could be made about sort of persecution that I'm more familiar with from my own work, and that is colonizing forces in Poland and the Soviet Union. So I worked on the annexation of Poland. And when the Germans invaded Poland and annexed the western part into the German Reich, the decision they made was to sift now the population and decide who was or could become German and who could not. Those who could become German were allowed to stay, the others were deported. And then, of course, the question arose, what is the defining criteria according to which we made this decision? And two camps emerged. One, mainly by the SS, was about race. They were talking about racial suitability. That would be the defining criteria. And the other one, around the German occupation administration, they were more talking about folkish suitability and folk as the defining criteria. And in a way, you would think that in the racial state, it's clear who emerged victorious, but it was exactly the opposite. So it was those factions who said, no, it's not about race. When you want to define or distinguish between Poles and Germans, race is not suited. That's exactly how they said it. But we need to talk about folk and what folk means in German history. And in a way, what I wanted to say with that is, it seems to me that certainly when it comes to Nazi Germany, and that's sort of what we're talking about, race has often become sort of a cultural phrase that I think threatens to obscure the many other divisions that were made and reasons people had to persecute and justify persecution of other people. And I just wanted to sort of bring this back into discussion for us to keep that in mind.
Go ahead.
So, you're right about the, certainly about the Rhineland, that was systematic. That was absolutely systematic. That was taking names, and I guess next time I do it, I'll be clearer that I was mostly talking about Germany. Kind of, but you're right, and they proved their capability, and actually they proved their capability in Namibia before then, really, but that wasn't the Nazis. But what the Nazis did, that bastards. My reading of the treatment of prisoners of war is that it was not systematic. And I'm reading the work of, say, Raphael Scheck, who wrote about black prisoners of war under the Nazis. Some people survived, some people didn't. Songor survived. Cy Grant survived. Actually, most black people who, whether they're colonial troops, British colonial or French colonial troops, most of them were not murdered, but many were. And I think that actually speaks to it being systemic rather than there's no, to my knowledge, unlike the sterilisation, which was absolutely commanded from central office, there was no central kind of position on the treatment of black troops. And in fact, at a certain point, black troops, they started getting, they started treating them better because there was a realization that, like, oh shit, we might win this thing. Then we're going to have to control a lot of Africa, and we're going to need these people. So somewhere around 41, they actually the treatment of the black soldiers becomes, it's not good, but it becomes better. They are systematic in terms of separating the black from the white soldiers. So the black soldiers are mostly kept in Germany, but the white soldiers are not. And then the one other thing that I would say is with regard to the racial state, and I guess I don't think of Nazi Germany as only being a racial state, but I do think of it as being a racial state. You know, and so racism is one language, but there are lots of languages. There's a language of sexism, there's a language of imperial domination, there is the language of disableism, and you know, that's kind of where intersectionality comes in, I think. But that in the same way that I don't think of America as only being a racial state at that time. But there's a moment, there are a few moments like this, but just one example of René Marron, who wins the Prix Goncourt in 1921, black, I think he's Martinican, might be Guadeloupean, but anyway, black person living in France, celebrated author, lives in Paris all the way through Nazi occupation. Then they're liberated. He's out drinking some wine in a local cafe with his white wife, and Americans come and they rough him up. And he says to Roy Otley, who's an African-American journalist there at the time, this didn't happen under the Nazis. He's not saying he wants the Nazis back, but so America is a racial state, a racist state, still is. But I don't think that's all it is. And it actually, at a certain point during that time, you speak to many, or you look at the work of many colonial people or colonized people, including people like C.L.R. James, who says, like, the freedom that I want isn't being denied to me by Hitler. That there is a sense of, like, it takes a little while, even for African Americans, to decide whether they're going to do this thing or not.
Can I ask Nash, this schema of, which is I'm still thinking through this, of particularities of race and racism, and in relation to how it plays out with different power structures and whether it's systemic or not. How do you see it through your work, particularly around marginalized communities more generally post-war?
Yeah. Thank you. So I just want to say thank you, Gary. That was really thought-provoking. I guess I wanted to think about sort of definitions and distinguishing between race, racism, and racialization. And kind of in answer to your last point, actually, I wonder whether they might use the term race, but Volk also has kind of racialization in terms of a differentiating a particular group of people. So yeah, maybe biological race has been discredited, but the racialization of particular communities and groups of people, I think that's not necessarily binary, But yeah, in terms of, I was thinking about, Gary, your sort of, visible differences and why do people just pretend to, not be Jewish? But I think, this idea that there's a distinction between sort of phenotypical racism and cultural racism is maybe too simplistic because, as you have also said, the sort of cultural connotation attached to physical differences, whether this is about too much of the wrong type of culture or too little culture. And so going back to what I said at the very beginning about race, racialization and racism, racialization is about that process of marking or making meaning about people. So, Stuart Hall, when talking about sort of discursive position, sort of refers to the work of anthropologist Mary Douglas and the idea of matter out of place. And so she says every culture has a kind of order of classification built into it, and this seems to stabilize the culture. So, as we've already talked about, the history of anti-blackness in Germany doesn't have that, meaning attached to it in the same way that it does. But the second point I wanted to make again was to pick up on this metaphor of language and dialect, because I think it does capture the complexity of how racism and processes of racialization work. But I'm interested in this idea about fluency, which we implemented in an intermediate level of anti-black racism. So I wanted to kind of think about what you talked about in Nazi Germany to Afro-Germans, but how does that compare to fluency in relation to the Herero and Nama people in Namibia? How do we distinguish between the colonial violence in Africa in the early 20th century and that perpetrated against Afro-Germans during the Nazi era? So thinking about the context of racial capitalism and settler colonial violence, infusing meanings around race, and when does that meaning making happen? The last point I wanted to raise was about, obviously what, the importance of this work that you're doing is about addressing erasure of certain histories, a particular episode in time. But I want to kind of bring it forward to current post-war German politics. A lot of it has been about sort of performative, possibly atonement for Nazi genocide of principally Jewish people. How does acknowledgement of these episodes of racism towards Afro-Germans affect contemporary racial dynamics in Germany? What is the contemporary language of racism in Germany? Where has it got to in its fluency? So, for example, I'm curious to think about how anti-Semitism, or what is often referred to as the new anti-Semitism, is currently being invoked in contemporary German society as an importation associated with Arab or other Muslim migrants, for example, in how pro-Palestinian protests are being policed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's I'm not going to get to all of the things that you said there, but I do, starting with the last one first, that Germany's colonial adventures have been almost completely erased from memory, completely. Even and that is a broad European problem. This, which. So I had to stop. I used to call it nostalgia, and I realized, well, it's not, because people forget in real time. In 1948, near Windrush, there was a colonial office survey. Asked people if they could name a single colony. Half of British people couldn't name a single colony. That was while they were colonizing much of Africa and the Caribbean. One person said Lincolnshire. So you've got this society that is on the one hand building a sense of itself as Rule Britannia, the whole thing covered in pink, And even as they're doing it, they are willfully forgetting what they're doing, which I would argue is a version of what we do now with people in small boats coming from places that we either have or are bombing, that we have a direct relationship between why they are leaving and why they are coming. And yet there is this, thing like we can't take in all the world's misery without any sense of like who was responsible for the bloody misery. It's stunning. I also think in connection to in the way that Palestine is discussed, the manner in which European anti-Semitism is written out of that story, and yes, this notion that is some way imported, which is a general problem, I think. But I remember when in the wake of 9/11, they would talk about Muslim community, they talk about forced marriages to foreigners. It's like that is the royal family. That's literally the royal family. That's all they do. And somehow it was understood as being alien. So that notion of like, well, what's it got to do with us is a very European one. That even in their most desperate moments, Americans cannot, even the most racist American, won't tell you that there wasn't slavery because they can't do it or that they weren't involved. Whereas British, French, they will tell you, well, it's got nothing to do with this. And so that also that sense, the Mary Douglas quote that you used, and that hierarchy and people being out of place is exactly what this is. We don't know where to put you, and that can go any which way. Right? That was my problem in France. We don't know what to do with you, but we can see that you're a problem. Or we do know what to do with you, like Russia. We're going to mislabel you, and then we're going to do that with you. And it's really not up to you how you're understood in those circumstances. And so, and the elision that you allude to, the way in which almost anything can be racial and is racial, the vote is while it is not the same as race, I think it's a racialized term. I think it's very difficult to think of a populace in the way that the Volk in France, or without it being, it's not impossible, but I think in the circumstances that you mentioned, race may not even necessarily be central, but it's certainly there. And that these terms are confused because they don't make sense. They're confused because they are a construct. And as soon everybody thinks they know what they mean by it until you ask them to write it down. With my students, I used to do a thing with Sandra Lang and Bliss Boyer. I would start the lesson about race by telling the story of both of them and then saying which one is the white guy and which one is the black guy. And after a lot of, usually there's a lot of like, her dad is messing around. There's always a lot of kind of, that somehow it's an episode of Love Island. Some other way of understanding it. But then when we get past that, halfway through the very jumbled conversation, I see, don't even try and make sense of it because it doesn't make sense. You just have to, you have to understand how we got here, but don't think that there is an answer that will make sense because race doesn't make sense. But in both cases, you can see how racism does.
Thank you, Gary. We're over time, but so briefly, please. But Nash, any thoughts that you want to conclude with?
Hard to follow. I guess I think enough of something you said very early on about this not being some kind of oppression Olympic. I think it's really important to understand the sort of particularities and specificities. And I want to flag up there are people doing work kind of about Yuval Davis recently published an article in Sociology about, is anti-Semitism racism, and there's a whole kind of discussion about that. Similarly, in my own work, I do a lot of work on Islamophobia or anti-Muslim racism, as I prefer to call it, because it is about drawing on continuities and parallels in order to understand by that.
Thank you. Yeah.
I want to come back to the question about the situation in Germany now, and I think the Holocaust plays quite a big role, but it was not like this from the very beginning. I mean, they had to be basically beaten to start talking about the crimes of the Nazi past. And when they started in the 70s or 80s, you could see that it was also done because it functions in a very different way as well. It could be taken as, okay, we're confronting this past, but we also use it to not confront other pasts or the present. And that's certainly true with the genocide in Namibia. One argument that was always brought up, well, but this doesn't compare, so it doesn't sort of require the same whatever attention. And this also has sort of distorting effects for the historiography itself, because when research started, certainly in Germany about Namibia, the attempts by historians was to then really put it into sort of a continuity. These were published from Windhoek to Warsaw, or from Africa to Auschwitz, in a way to sort of making the point that there is a continuity, but you can see how this research was itself driven by sort of an attempt to drive this home to Germans that when you talk about the Holocaust, you need to talk about the other crimes as well. And it's still how it, I think, very often works in Germany. On the one hand, sort of this talk about the Holocaust, but then it being used now, as you said about pro-Palestinian protests in Germany now, it's in a way one crime being used to sort of not talk about others that are now ongoing in Germany. And that's pretty disturbing, but it speaks to what you were saying about how what we need to understand is not the logic behind that, because there's none, but how it works and how it functions, and it does work.
Thank you. I'm so sorry we've run out of time. We can continue these conversations over a drink, which I think is just outside. So please do join us. But before we finish, please do join me in thanking Professor Gary Younge.